Johnson. Thank you so much again.
Thank you very much, Yulia. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the Zantop Memorial Lecture in Comparative Literature. This lecture honors the memory of Susanna Zantop, a former Dartmouth College faculty member in German Studies and Comparative Literature, a graduate program director in Comparative Literature, and a path-breaking scholar of German colonialism. Zantop was an active and adored member of the Dartmouth community for over 30 years until her tragic death in 2001. This event is sponsored by Dartmouth's program in Comparative Literature and has been held annually in Professor Zantop's honor since 2002. I am honored to introduce this year's speaker, Dr. Mary Carruthers. Mary Carruthers is Remark Professor Emeritus of Literature at New York University, and in the past 15 years has also held research positions in the University of Oxford, including Balliol, All Souls, and St. Hilda's Colleges. She's a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the Medieval Academy of America, a corresponding fellow of the British Academy, and a socio straniera, or corresponding fellow, of the Accademia Nazionale dei Lincei in Rome. Happily retired, she now divides her time between New York and Oxford. Her research interests lie in the psychological, socio-cultural, and textual aspects of medieval rhetoric in the Latin traditions, in reading practices deriving from monastic meditation and prayer, and in questions of creative thinking and methods of composing in various medieval cultures, clerical and courtly. In addition to numerous academic articles and edited collections, her books include The Book of Memory, a study of memory in medieval culture, The Craft of Thought, Meditation, Rhetoric, and the Making of Images, 400 to 1200, and most recently, The Experience of Beauty in the Middle Ages. Her work on verbal and nonverbal rhetoric, memory, performance, and invention is considered seminal and widely cited by art historians, musicologists, psychologists, and even neuroscientists. Few scholars have such a wide interdisciplinary influence. Her lecture today is based in part on her current book project, Creative Geometries, the Art of Invention in the Middle Ages. Today, Professor Carruthers will speak for about 30 to 40 minutes with a Q&A to follow. During the Q&A, you can ask your question live by using the reactions function to raise your virtual hand or just typing a question in chat. We will keep the chat function turned off during the lecture to avoid distraction, but we'll turn it on in meetings. Thank you very much for being here, Professor Carruthers. And with that, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. So, Carolyn, could I have the first slide? Carolyn? There we go. Yes, thank you. As Dante the Pilgrim's envisioning mind rises up in wonder towards its focus, that single tiny point beside which the smallest of stars looks as big as the moon, he encounters, as you all remember, a series of progressively luminous envisioned images. An old man, Bernard of Clairvaux, whose radiant smile purifies and raises the pilgrim's vision ever higher. Next, a volume in which are bound together as one, s'interna legato quasi conflatti insieme, all the great creative variety of Aristotelian style natural causes, substances, accidents, and their diverse particulars. Note that the word Dante uses is volume, not libro, for he envisions a rolled up scroll, the Latin volumen, rather than a codex. Then, could I have the second slide, Carolyn? Right. Then as his mind, all rapt, leaps up again toward the moment when all human memory and with it human reasoning and speech must fail, he begins to gaze at the final visionary figure of tre giri, the three intersecting, ever combining, moving and yet motionless wheels that figure the Trinity to his overstretched human mind. And he likens his ardent intellectual effort to that of a geometer who sets all his mind to the squaring of the circle, per misurar lo cerco, yet for all his thinking does not discover the principle that he needs. But as Dante, in his own straining to see the principal divine point, also tries to square the circle to understand the impossible of what he is seeing, his vision fails altogether with his language, his reasoning and memory, his desire and ardent will alone spinning together, propelled with the great cosmic wheel of the fixed stars. Or rather, what fails here is his alta fantasia, for his ordinary sensation-derived human fantasia was surpassed long before. Indeed, at the start of Paradiso, when he sailed the ship of his poetry into waters that were never sailed before. These 5 matters that I've brought together here form the focal points of this talk: the nature of vision and envisioning, the rolled up scroll, Bernard of Clairvaux, alta fantasia, and the insoluble geometric problem of squaring the circle. My overall approach to this final canto of Paradiso is via the rhetorical and poetic techne of composing, that is invention, and its necessary constant companion, analysis and ordering, that is disposition. The placing of the matters we have chosen to speak about into the seats of topica proper to each in the plan or ratio with which we have chosen to unfold our creative work. Though in ancient school manuals of rhetoric, invention is always treated as though it were a procedure completed prior to disposition, in practice, the 2 activities are conjoined, or at least they should be, lest one end up with a bunch of disparate scraps and shards that one's audience will likely soon lose patience with. I hope I will be able to persuade you that the scraps and shards of my first paragraph do have coherence, even logical relationship, though not always in the logic of formal scholastic syllogism. Okay, so Carolyn, could you just turn off the PowerPoint at this point? Okay, thank you. Shaping our thoughts, their coherent placement conflati insieme, is indeed mainly a matter of geometry. But Dante's own practice of geometry-based topical reasoning is not solely the one taught in the schools of 13th century Paris, which were so often the only authority invoked by the Dante commentaries I grew up on 40 years ago. It comes just as much from monastic traditions concerning the practices of meditation and contemplative prayer, as articulated especially among 12th century Cistercians and Victorines, whose concepts regarding the psychology of envisioning and the nature of vis imaginativa fantasia, while not wholly incompatible with later Aristotelian ideas, do have different emphases and a less formally syllogistic understanding of the role of visualizing, that is, of visio, fantasia, and imaginatio, with respect to reasoning or ratiocinatio. The Cistercian methods make use of a more complex geometry than the basic triangles and squares employed in the logical organon texts of the schools. This, of course, is why Bernard, and with him Victorine Cistercian teaching about contemplation, is an essential ingredient for understanding why that intently focused geometer appears just as the poem makes its final measureless leap into silence. The geometrical figures, called geometricalia in medieval Latin, are conceived fundamentally in the Middle Ages as the traces and tracks, the vestigia, left by prior movements, motion being defined as sequential changes of location occurring also as moments of time. The fundamental principle of ancient and medieval physics is change. All physical change is a motion, and a motion is both temporal and spatial. The traces that we measure of these temporal spatial motions can be considered mathematically, according to Augustine, Boethius, and a cluster of learned 11th century mathematicians, in 3 terms: linea, superficies, and soliditas. A line, the covering or surface area in which several conjoined lines demarcate, and mass, soliditas, which is the 3rd way of measuring. As we say, all have their dimensions. Another word used in medieval geometries is intervallum. Both words can refer to durations of time as well as of space. So a line has one intervallum length. Surface is measured by intersecting lines enclosing flat planes of 2 dimensions, length and width. The surface area enclosed seems to us to be flattened, like all superficies, a word which means literally a covering. Think of a blanket on a bed. Or they can be measured as also having solidness, soliditas, its 3-dimensional extension, that is mass. But a point, punctus, what Dante sees, has no dimension at all, neither of space nor of time. It is rather the initiator, the beginning of all measuring, what Augustine calls the numerus sine numero, the number that itself has no number, the mathematical one that enfolds and generates from itself all the many others. Moreover, all the geometrical figures, the geometricalia, are themselves only mental abstractions made by human minds from the actual beings that exist in nature. God created all natural forms in their real, living, and particular being. To try to understand them, however inadequately, humans invented geometry. So ponder this difference. When I first was taught elementary geometry, aged around 12, I learned that a line shortest distance between 2 points, the received Euclidean definition. We were then encouraged to take our rulers and measure said line as fixed in a space from start to end. A line was a static object. But many pre-modern Neoplatonist geometries, unlike Euclid, at least in his textbook, defined a line as unfolding from a single point. The single point is primary, and lines unfold from it into time and also into space, in the measurable intervals that fundamentally characterize the universe as we comprehend it. Time is thus a condition for space. There are often disjointed continuity, which is the aesthetic and stylistic principle of Concordia discourse, being the reverse image of perfect eternity. Any particular line traced from A to B will measure a distance, but instead of thinking of its measured length as an end product, one thinks of it processionally as movement extending in temporal space. Similarly, a circle is defined as the curving movement traced by the arm of a compass around the fixed central point in relation to which it is made. The words circle and line both refer to the motions by which they are created. Circulus to the trace made by the movement of this, and line referring to the cord which draws and measures. Latin linea, lineos, Greek linen, deriving ultimately from the Indo-European name of the flax plant, the source of the threads from which linen cloth and also measuring cord were made. This privileging of a single creating point from which natural shapes all evolve is certainly attributable to the Augustinian Neo-Pythagorean philosophical idea that all created forms are implied, implicare, infolded, within a single starting point, the principle which the geometer seeks, from which dimensionless point the created cosmos moves outward, unfolding, explicare, into the myriad of less perfect reflections that constitute the forms of its creation. But it's tempting to think of the notion as having a practical origin as well as one only theoretical. The inscribed volume of nature records God's word, the logos, in forms that are like the letters recording human speech. Scripts always begin with a single point, as a scribe places a stylus or perhaps a chisel onto a material surface, and then with straight or curving motions unfolds the strokes of each letter as his pen is led around, leaving behind its ink traces. This motion was in fact called ductus, and learning the ductus of the letter forms particular to various scripts is the basis of scribal training. Actually drawing out the letter with one's pen which as a direct sensory experience is animatedly tactile as well as visual, is the nature of writing then in a way that it no longer is when one sets or reads or types with prefabricated letters. As those straight and curved strokes intimately and immediately demonstrate how such movements unroll in real time from the initial point of one's pen. Could I get the next slide, Carolyn? That's it. The orderly universe itself comes into being as God draws its boundary onto emptiness with his compass, as described in Proverbs 8:27. In early medieval geometry manuscripts, the circle figure, always drawn with a compass, its central point often emphasized in ink, is labeled sphera, or sometimes variant spelling just sphera without the H. But it's rarely called circulus. In classical Latin, circulus is an adjective describing how something is moving. The noun circulator denoted the town crier, the official who went about the town proclaiming the news. His official name derives from his movements, how he goes, not who he is. Similarly, the figure for a square drawn in a manuscript is regularly labeled cubus, C-U-B-U-S or C-Y-B-U-S, a cube, and that for a triangle, pyramidus, pyramid, and also prism. Not only should such figures be understood to represent movements, but also in order to be fully comprehended and understood, they must be reimagined as three-dimensional. For again, movements can only occur as changes in time. The basic definition of a sphere is that all lines within it are of the same length. So to draw one truly, one places the foot of one's compass instrument on an initiating point, the principium, and then one unfolds from it in equidistant measures a curving line that circumferens, or is carried around that center point until it returns to its beginning. Alternatively, they will say that the line is circumducta, is led around from that central point. And you can see that in the Bible Moralisée there, because the compass that God has is directly on the point in the middle of the yet uncreated earth. The entire geometrical concept, basically, is measuring movements generated from a single point. Boethius' elementary definition of a sphere is that a sphere is the leading around of a semicircle, completing and thereby perfecting it by returning the line to the place where it started. Circumductio is the word that he uses. And Augustine similarly defines a circle as, quote, the figure whose boundary is everywhere concurrent, its equality distributed by no angle, and from whose center equal lines can be drawn to every part of its boundary. You can see in the left hand from the Las Huelgas Beatos, you can see the preparer of the page with the compass in his hand. So the principium, the starting point of these unfolding forms, is the creation point, in principio, right at the beginning. This is why Dante's Geometer so intently seeks the principle of how the divine circle perfectly creates the earthly linear human world figured as a square. But he will never find it, because how a square and a circle perfectly fit is incalculable by human mathematical means. The incalculability, incidentally, of pi and its inexact value of 3.14, which is how it's usually expressed in the manuscript, was known in the medieval Latin world to the 10th century mathematician Gervais of Aurillac, for one, as the answer to the Archimedean problem of squaring the circle. The point from which the cosmos extends has no extent, neither dimension nor time. In itself, it is incompatible with the measurable temporal earth. And yet, all the manifold creation we experience unfolds from it as though written in a great scroll containing all of space-time. At the cosmic center, the Earth, are the constant movements of creation and destruction, change and the instability of time, the geometry of linear and retrograde and circular motions unfolding infinitely, but not eternally. It is a distinctive feature of Christian Neoplatonist physics that infinity and eternity are not the same thing. Infinity exists in motions stretching through time from a known beginning, again, in principio, even though eternity is beyond all time and motion and without time. They are mirror images, and so the temporal one is reversed. It is imperfect and incomplete, formed from substances and accidents and their peculiarities, all placed properly within the divinely ordained universal syntax, from Greek taxis, meaning order, rather like the complex, grammatically well-crafted Greek and Latin sentences, the creating principle of logos, or word, and also elegant mathematical statements, the creating principle of arithmos, number and measure. Since it has a starting point, infinity has a grammar and tenses and number, but eternity, being without time, has neither grammar nor tense nor number. It is beyond all language and all mathematical measure. Carolyn, turn it off for a minute, if you would, please. Thank you. But human beings are bounded by dimension and time, by the forms and shapes of created nature. A wordplay known to Thomas Aquinas relates the Latin word mens, meaning mind, to mensura, measure. For measuring, Aquinas says, is the very essence of human intelligence. It is how the human mind understands. So, having tried to follow Dante by stretching our minds upward toward the eternal principle, my talk will now go in the reverse direction, from the divine back to the human. I'm sure you'll be very relieved by that. I will be. And talk instead about human creating, which is also importantly a matter of geometry, but of a wholly mundane sort. I will start with an analogy from everyday nature, the sort of natural analogies that Dante is famous for. In this instance, the daily behavior of birds, especially of starlings. So the next slide, Carolyn. There. In his influential treatise De Contemplatione Maior on the practices of spiritual contemplation, the treatise is sometimes referred to in English as Benjamin Major, composed around 1159, 1160. Richard of St. Victor described the active process of human thinking, what we now call getting our ideas, as being like the flocking of many little birds. This analogy is particularly rich and serves well as a motif for the rest of this talk. The analogy illuminates the essential role that geometry plays in all forms of human thought, even when trying to go beyond reason. For what it captures so well is the flexible provisional shaping that our thinking requires to be at all productive. Characteristic of evil thought is its inability to adjust. So Dante's Satan is frozen in ice because his will and mind are thoroughly frozen into just one shape. Indeed, Satan has no mind, and flapping his wings can take him nowhere. But Richard compares creative human thinking to birds flocking in and out, up and down, circling, flying apart, coming densely together in a cloud, sometimes seeming to be fixed in the air in one place, constantly changing their configuration. In English, this behavior is called a murmuration, and it's a term that is used particularly for starlings, a bird whose habits were known throughout Europe, at least from antiquity. Next slide. In this same passage, Richard identifies three modes of human thinking: cogitation, meditation, contemplation, distinguishing them by their movements and directions. Cogitation's motions are shapeless and indirect, wandering about here and there without any particular end in mind. The analogy Richard draws with avian flocking behavior clarifies how our initial cogitating is a process of gradually associating our many random thoughts and imaginings into organized shapes, a kind of murmuration of the half-formed ideas that are just flying about in our heads. Its opposite mode, directly opposite mode, which is contemplation, by contrast spreads out evenly to illuminate all things within its single ray, a light without boundaries, dimensionless and hence also geometryless, but encompassing in its illumination all that can be understood both through human reasoning and beyond it. And meditation, which bridges the two extremes, presses ahead, Richard says, quote, with great perseverance, with great industry of mind, often through arduous and rough places to the end of its path, end quote. Meditation, in other words, is characterized by shape and method. Its motions are directed, and though its paths may not always be easy to follow, it is always, quote, employed ardently in a search for truth. For meditation is an investigation, investigatio, or tracking, a metaphor that derives from hunting. It is not the evagatio, the rambling of our first thoughts. So wonder and ardent desire are meditation's motive energies that should lead our rational, purposeful thinking upward, alta, to fly confidently even to the highest heights. So close the slides again, Carolyn, if you would, for a moment. Starling murmuration applies to flocking behaviors that are both visual and audible in the sibilant whistling of many wings. The English usage that applies it to starlings is attested only from the mid-15th century. But in Latin, long before this English usage, a murmur was the preliminary stage of inventing and composing. In a widely used account of the liberal arts curriculum from the late 4th century by Martianus Capella, called The Marriage of Philology and Mercury, Dame Rhetoric explains murmur's role in reading and composing. Much practice and effort are required, for which this is certainly observed to be the norm, that we write out those subject matters which we wish readily to recollect for our composition. And if the matters we are studying should be rather long, they will cling within our minds more easily when divided into parts. Next, it is necessary to attach markers to each matter which we wish especially to retain, nor are these divisions used in reading aloud, but rather for meditating on in a murmur. And it is plain that memory is more fully invigorated at night than during the day, when widespread silence aids us, nor is our attention, our intention, called away from outside by our senses, end quote. This account closely resembles those of Cicero and Quintilian. It's the standard ancient account of the early stages of invention. And in order productively to use our inventory, our library, both mental and material, as Rhetoric describes it, we first select those matters from our stores that we may wish particularly to include in our composition. It is wise even now to heed the common reading advice given variously to all students, like this bit from Hugh of St. Victor: learn and retain everything. You will see later that nothing is superfluous. And from Peter the Chanter, also 12th century: if you are tenacious of memory and do not just skim over your reading, you will discover what you can learn and better retain it and always be able to produce it, end quote. So murmur is not yet formed speaking, creating but not finished, the subvocal expression of some germinal ideas and half-formed phrases muttered to oneself, but still a long distance from the fully voiced viva voce that brings the work into full public being. It's still in process, tractanda, but not yet tractatus, to use a medieval distinction. And the ephemeral nature of murmur and its media, which are wax or sand surfaces, leftover scraps of papyrus or linen or vellum, or much later on, cheap paper, is the key to its practical value. It is entirely erasable and fungible. Murmur serves the purposes of drafting and shaping as people invent and edit their compositions. And as such, it is as much about forgetting and canceling as it is about remembering and conceiving. But all that flitting about of our thoughts, all that changing in one direction, then in another, at times, if we are graced by luck or by genius, will suddenly come clear in the shape into which all our pieces find their place, that eureka moment when all our stumbling thoughts come convincingly clear, like the shape made finally and suddenly by the starlings. I'll now try to forge the final link in my chain of influences on these lines of Paradiso 33 and bridge the geometer's intense desire to understand with the radiant, clarifying smile of the Cistercian Bernard of Clairvaux, as with it he motions Dante's high envisioning up toward the real divine point. Could I have the next slide then, Caroline? That's it. Here is an image of a human brain's alta fantasia. This clumsily drawn diagram of human perception and conceptualizing is in a Cistercian manuscript, now Trinity College, Cambridge, 0716. The text it accompanies is a 12th century work on the spirit and the soul, popular well beyond Dante's time, not only in mystical circles, but also in university circles in Paris, a work Dante may very well have known himself, though there's no necessity for that. The ideas in it are taken from much copied treatises by Augustine, William of St. Thierry, Isaac of Stella, Hugh of St. Victor, Bernard of Clairvaux. In short, it's a compendium of Victorine Cistercian teaching about the mind and the soul, what are the human mind's perceiving powers and how well they work together in thinking, and about the crucial role played by fantasia, our human mind's abilities to form the images required in all human thinking. It is an ancient and Aristotelian commonplace that humans cannot think without the tools of mental images. This idea also permeates monastic meditation practices even before the very earliest of Greek Christianity. Roots are in Jewish mysticism and very likely some as well in Buddhism. An ordinary human imagination, that is fantasia, is necessary also for the envisioning work that reason cannot follow. The concept of a higher imagination, Dante's alta fantasia, directly illuminated by divine radiance, is distinctively Augustinian, and in the 12th century, an idea particularly associated with Cistercian and Victorine spirituality. In the drawing in this Trinity College manuscript, you can see that fantasia is separate from imaginatio. It is placed in a compartment in the topmost zone of the skull, whereas imaginatio is lower, one of the ordinary mental powers that receive, perceive, and conceptualize the sensory data that we humans get daily from the created world around us in the forms of our decidedly unexalted human experiences. In this Cistercian picture, fantasia is literally alta, in the brain area elevated to be closest to the direct inner light of intellectual illumination, where human intelligence can thus most directly receive its influence and know best the truth. Okay, that slide can go off now too, I think. Thanks. When discussing the liberal arts in Didascalicon, his magisterial treatise on monastic curriculum, Hugh of St. Victor writes of geometry that it is, quote, the teaching of fixed measurements and the depiction of shapes for contemplating, through which the boundaries of each and every matter can be made clear. Or in other words, he says, geometry is the wellspring of our sensory knowledge and the originator of the things we say, end quote. When I first came upon this statement, I was greatly puzzled, as were many others. What did geometry have to do with speaking and contemplation? And since then, as I pursued the matter, I've discovered that in fact, geometry among ancient and medieval writers has always had a very great deal to do with literature and composing. Hugh was quoting a maxim from Cassiodorus. The topics, he says, this is Cassiodorus, are the seats of arguments, sedes argumentorum, the well springs of our sense-based cognitions and the originators of the things that we say. Cassiodorus is defining dialectic, specifically the analytical method of topics, the topica, about which much was written by Aristotle, by Cicero, by Boethius, and which was studied throughout the Middle Ages as an essential part of language arts, the trivium. Topica teaches the method of placing the pieces of your invention within a coherently shaped structure. It was taught both for logically analyzing materials by means of topical categories, that is dialectic, and for composing those arguments in new work, that is for invention or rhetoric. Topical reasoning always had this dual function, assessment and analysis, ars judicandi, and also creating and composing, ars inveniendi, just as dialectic and rhetoric were considered to be aspects of the same rational instrument, as the very same hand offers both the closed fist of dialectic and the open hand of rhetoric. Or, in Aristotle's analogy, are the strophe and the antistrophe that structure a Greek chorus. Quintilian insists that the education of an orator, including training in geometry, as well as grammar, music, and acting, specifically because of its close relationship to analytical reasoning and constructing persuasive arguments. In fact, he concludes, quote, since an orator has to speak on all manner of subjects, okay, all manner of subjects, he cannot be an orator without geometry, end quote. He also says, in a rare philosophical moment, that its study can elevate your mind to consider even the cosmos itself. The next slide, Carolyn. That's it. That philosophical theme, as we've seen, was greatly developed in medieval Christianity by the natural philosophers of the medieval schools and by the contemplative orders alike, each in their way exploring both the power and also the limits of the human condition of understanding by means of measuring. In 1570, the first translation of Euclid into English was published in London, together with an extensive mathematical preface by the Elizabethan polymath Dr. John Dee, advisor to the Queen, who as a young man had lectured in Paris on this subject. He writes, geometry is the knowledge of that which is everlasting. It will lift up, therefore, O gentle sir, our mind to the verity, and by that means it will prepare the thought to the philosophical love of wisdom, that we may turn or convert toward heavenly things, both mind and thought. Chiefly, therefore, commandment must be given that such as do inhabit this most honorable city of London by no means despise geometry. Thank you. I've put up here, I'm going to some more, just some background here for you. These are very useful definitions. I hope at some point you can manage to download this material. But this from Isidore of Seville, which is the sort of classic definition, for indeed mind is memory. And then a scholastic version of that from Thomas Aquinas, a little more Aristotelian. It seems that mind is the essence of the soul, wherefore mind comprising memory, intellect, and will is the essence of the soul. If, however, it is considered in terms of how it measures anything and knows the measures of natural things, then truly mentis is its name, for it is called mens, mind, from metiendo, measuring, in that its knowledge is collected and it compares one thing with another. So comparison and contrast, collection, recollection, comparison and contrast, that is what the mind does. And then I've given you the quote also from John Dee that I just read out. So it's both a very practical sort of thing, and in geometry texts, they always say that that Roman geometry and medieval geometry has everything to do with measuring fields, which is true, but it also has always had this very strong connection with contemplation. And then finally, another slide, Carolyn, is the last one, which I'm not going to go through at great length because I know we'd like to get to the chat, but these are simply a bunch of materials that I certainly have found very helpful myself and that I think of as essential. Most of them are not specifically about Dante. They are, in fact, more general things. I just mentioned the one book by Muramokan, which is on Richard of St. Victor specifically. So you might take a look at these, and also very much to this particular talk, I recommend to you the Ordered Universe website, which is very much on medieval physics and Robert Gross test, but brings together these extraordinarily fruitful interdisciplinary people. So it's worth checking out. Okay, so I think I'm done now.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. A big virtual or in person in the silence of your own room applause. Thank you so much, Professor. That was wonderful. Incredibly rich and also very densely packed with ideas. And I'm sure we have many questions. I think it's going to give me new meaning from everything to Dante's Commedia to it has me thinking about Donne's valediction forbidding mourning and the compass image. But so we'll open up now to questions. Nathan and I will be monitoring, and if you'd like to, I see there's already a hand raised, or maybe that was a clap, but oh no, these are real hands. So we'll be taking questions from both the chat. You can post it there if you'd like, and one of us will read it aloud, or of course you can voice your own question. And without further ado, Tom, it looks like you have your hand up and you're already unmuted, so go right ahead.
Did I really get there first? I'm not sure I really deserve that, but
that's okay.
Mary, that was absolutely wonderful. I'm one of the weird people that Mary just referred to in this Ordered Universe project in Gross test. So I was actually going to illustrate to ask you, Mary, whether this fascinating dynamic world you gave us, it's almost as if nothing ever sat still before 1600. And I've just grasped this. And it's opened up to me something I wish we'd heard you before writing volume 1 of our Gross test scientific and humanities collaborations, because in his De Generatione Sonorum, he has all this extraordinary first of all, a dynamic description of all the figures you could possibly have, circles and figures of 8 and all sorts of things, combines linear motion and circular motion. He starts combining all these weird motions and creates figures way beyond spheres and circles. And then in the next breath, or even in the same breath, talks about human speech in this geometrical way. And with this, so are you telling us that there's actually something, rather than something just purely geometrical, as we would say, oh, he's describing the motion of the tongue and the motion of the wind and the breath, he's actually far beneath this at a sort of geometric level, not just of speech, but of discourse. Is that what he's doing?
Yes, I think that's exactly right. And in fact, the notion goes back, the notion is actually in Priscian. So we're back to the time of Boethius again. But Priscian says that all notes have 3 dimensions. In other words, he thinks in some ways of the duration and pitch, and then loudness. Those are the 3 dimensions. And of course, duration is a dimension of time, obviously. But there's a kind of solidity to notes that we simply don't seem to have. In fact, it seems to me that the only thing in modern science, it seems to me, that more or less captures these notions that you get in Priscian is a sonogram. Not music not annotated music as we see it on a staff, which is 2-dimensional, or looks 2-dimensional. It's not actually, but it looks that way. But a sonogram actually does give you a sense of pitch and of width like this, and of also loudness. So it's all been very interesting to me, because much of this, let me go backtrack a bit. The 2 books that I read that really put me onto this were, and these are modern books, both of which I'm sure you know, Tom. One is David Albertson's book on mathematical theologies, which I highly recommend to people, which is really on William of St. Thierry in particular, but in a historical context. He also goes up as far as the 15th century to Cusanus. And the other one is a book by an Italian physicist called The Order of Time. This is Carlo Roncalli, Carlo Rovelli, The Order of Time. They're both on that list of suggested reading. You can get to it. He writes about physics in a way that even I can read.
He's tremendous. He
is tremendous. He is tremendous, and he writes about it very much from bringing the historical dimension very much into it. So I think you will find it very interesting. And in fact, the comment that was made about it being a static universe, that's very much Rovelli, because it's Newton is really sort of the villain of his book in a very, very interesting way. So I do recommend those two.
Thank you. So one tiny Grosseteste nugget, this is just 5 seconds,
Yep.
is Grosseteste de Sfera he has his own completely unique way of describing a sphere. It's not a point from a distance. Grosseteste starts with a semicircle, but it's just as dynamic. He says, spin a semicircle around over its axis like this. And you have a sphere. And I just think this is delicious because he's always one dimension higher than everyone else, but he still thinks of geometry as dynamic or kinetic.
He's not quite one dimension beyond everybody, because that's in Boethius.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, right.
But he's taken the standard Boethian definition and animated it.
Okay, good. Thank you. Animated Boethius, lovely. Thank you.
Yes.
So lovely. Thank you. Wonderful talk. Thank you again.
Thanks, Tom.
Great. And next we can hear from Jonathan, please.
Hi, thank you so much for that that talk, Mary. I just wanted one thing about the semicircle into the circle is it's also in Alan of Lille's Sermon on the Intelligible Sphere, and he talks about time being in the he's drawing on Boethius as well from the De Arithmetica. So this is not my question. This is just responding very quickly to Tom that the time, which is the image of eternity, time is the semicircle, and eternity is the full sphere, and that's so there is a kind of, I think, as I now know from Mary's talk, there's a dynamic kind of relationship between the two. So I had one observation and then one, I think it's a question. The observation was about the image on the manuscript of the De Spiritu et Anima. And it struck me that picture was not illustrating anything, unless I'm wrong. I mean, I may be wrong. I don't think it's illustrating anything in the De Spiritu et Anima. It's the powers of the soul in the mind were the Avicennan kind of model with like sense, imaginativa, estimativa, reason, memory. So I'd be interested if you had thoughts about what was happening with that illuminated image of the brain and how the Cistercian or Victorine kind of higher fantasy related to the Avicennan tradition of the mind. So okay, that's one. Maybe it's probably best if I have another question, maybe I'll just leave it in case other people want to speak. So that's my question: the relationship in the powers of the mind in that image in relation to Avicenna and Cistercian mysticism.
Yeah, that drawing was made very much after that particular Cistercian text was copied, and the Cistercian text itself may have been copied at a monastery in northern France. I can't remember which one. The person who's really done a lot of work on this is Constant Muse on this particular text. But what's interesting about that is that facing the drawing is a very scholastic style list of the questiones and their parts. And the manuscript itself came from the Cistercian manuscript, rather from the Cistercian monastery, but to the Collège Saint-Bernard in Paris. So I think what's happened is that by the time somebody gets around to drawing that particular brain, he is conflating the Avicennan with the Victorine, but very firmly putting it in the Victorine Cistercian tradition by elevating fantasia in that way. It's an awkward marriage, but they tried to make it work.
Thank you. By the way, the De Spiritu is already a mess. It's like calling it a consistent picture of the mind in the De Spiritu Anima. I don't know. It seems already kind of. It's just they've just thrown to. It's already this awkward compilation of anything they could get their hands on. Yes, so it's understandable if it's illuminated like that.
Wonderful. Thank you. Susan, go right ahead.
Thank you, Mary. That was brilliant. I have a couple of questions, very short questions. Were Lull, Renan Lull, and Matthew Paris's Volvels pretty images, and Steinred's musical spheroids, ways of adding the sort of kinesthetic aspect to memory, and do they relate to this? And then just an aside, the starlings really are so important now in the study of music and the brain.
Okay. Well, starlings are wonderful, aren't they? Lul. I think what's happening with Lul, now Lul is quite late, from my standpoint. I realize he's not entirely late, but he's picked up on, as you know, he was not himself a university cleric. What he's picked up on is, and translated for much more of a, well, not secular audience, but for a perhaps more court audience in a way. A whole lot of these ideas that were part of monastic culture long before. So it's one of the main differences where I part company, certainly with Francis Yates, for example, who says that it is Lul who brings movement into the arts of memory for the first time. This is simply not true. I think in the monastic tradition, and indeed earlier, I just think that people's imaginations were better. And I think that they understood, because they've been taught, that those planar figures that you see in the texts of geometry need always to be understood as three-dimensional and indeed four-dimensional, because then they have time added to them. So it's always been an extremely dynamic geometry, not a static one at all.
Absent the paper wheel charts, the coverings, the blankets, so to speak.
Yes, oh, the blanket, yes, the area. But as I said, they're very clear about this too, that the planar figures are a human abstraction from nature. And in this way, they're very unlike what becomes then Renaissance Platonism, as I understand it, where there's this notion that the geometric forms are sort of the seminal ideas behind all creation. So that the forms come first and then come the created beings. Not here. They absolutely part company with that, because that is a contradiction of Genesis. God creates everything from the beginning. And we, in an effort to understand it, have made geometry as we have made grammar.
And Theinred was a grammarian, and then he had these beautiful spheroids in his treatise on music, where he was trying to expand on Guidonian theory.
Yeah. I think those are all efforts to depict motion and time.
Okay.
Yeah.
Next, we can hear from Margaret, please.
Hi, Mary. Welcome to Dartmouth, and thank you so much for this fascinating lecture. You'll have to forgive me for being a classicist and very much not a medievalist.
I forgive you.
But I got to say that I took great pleasure in hearing the subsequent fortunes of some of the texts that I work with and love. Of course, especially Aristotle's De Anima and the business about fantasia. It's just so interesting to see that coming back in this way. But I was intrigued and a little puzzled by the bit about the square roots, the square root of 2. And of course, my mind goes immediately to Plato's Meno. That sequence, which I think many people know, where Socrates questions a slave, and there's this diagram that appears in every text, because you have to have a diagram to understand the sequence. And the geometrical issue, turns on the square root of 2, but then leads the discussion in such a way that he claims to have established actually the pre-existence of the psyche, because the slave, this young boy's mind must have already been in contact with the necessary geometrical concepts in order to get where he gets. So it just made me wonder, because you didn't really mention Plato very much in the talk, whether that text is present in this discourse at all.
Not directly, because they didn't have the Meno in Latin Christianity, at least not the text itself directly. This is that idea, and certainly the value of pi, the square roots, all that comes via the Arabic writings. Gerbert of Aurillac, whose name I mentioned, later Pope Sylvester II. So at the very end of the 10th century is one of the earliest roots for that Arabic language textual material, mathematical material that is actually Hindu Arabic. And it's coming from India, via India and Persia, via Arabic writings. And we medievalists are just beginning to understand this at this point. But Gerbert of Aurillac being somewhere up near Reims, actually did some of his training as a young monk in Catalonia, where he had access to Arabic mathematical texts via the Spanish connection. And then he returned and taught in Reims, and from there was very much an influence in Lotharingia, the area of the upper Rhine, or lower Rhine, I should say, there, what is now Belgium, basically. But it's always an indirect route, and therefore those texts do not, in fact, mention the Plato treatises themselves. So I mean, I think that the medieval, well, they must have known them in Byzantine Greece, did they not?
Yes.
But of course, they didn't have access to them directly at that point. I mean, the West and the East are completely separated at this particular point, as you know, through most of the Middle Ages. And so the bridge really is through North Africa and Spain and Egypt and Baghdad, of course.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much. That is exactly what I was hoping to learn. And I just wanted to throw in there a big thanks to the department for recording this so that we can go back and access the recording later.
Thank you, Margaret. We're going to pivot to take a question from the chat, and we'll come back to Klaus and Kenneth. We still see your hands raised, so hang on to those thoughts. Hartley Miller asks, Professor Carruthers, I wanted to ask about the idea that geometry revealed a divinely ordained universal syntax. I loved that phrase. So would poetry and composing be considered ways of trying to emulate this syntax? But what about the vagaries of vernacular syntax?
Well, first of all, at this time, as you probably know, vernacular languages don't have syntax officially. Do remember that the first grammar of the English language was actually written in the 17th century and was composed in Latin, which is why we have all these awkward vocabulary, of these awkward terms for English vocabulary, for English grammar rather, because English grammar, and also I should say French, German, all of them were sort of shoehorned into traditional Roman grammar categories. So that takes care of the vernacular. There is a ditty, okay? But the notion of the syntax as being a universal principle is, gosh, it certainly is in Augustine. And you think of it just as the matter of order, right? So that's kind of basic. So that, yes, of course, I do remember, for example, that poetry is taught with music in the liberal arts curriculum. So it's thought of just as much as a mathematical subject because of the meter as it is as a literary subject. Also remember that in spoken oratory, one of the elements of a truly elegant oration is to use what was known as the cursus, which is the metrical patterning of the ending of sentences and so forth. So I think with spoken language, and remember that this is, after all, essentially an oral society. Yes, of course they read books, but in fact, it doesn't really come into full being until it is spoken publicly, delivered publicly. It's much more, it's very aware of the rhythm of speech. In a way, it seems to me that for people whose only experience basically is reading silently written text, simply isn't. I mean, writing is a kind of tool of speaking. So I am not in the least troubled, although some of my colleagues have been over the years, by people, literary scholars, who find numerical patterns and rhythmic patterns in speech. I mean, heaven's sake, Dante talk about, mathematical patterns. And obviously that's in there because that is in fact the part of the reflection of the grandeur of his project, basically. But he's not alone. It's imitated a lot. It's imitated in Middle English, for example, by the Middle English poem called Pearl, and others in that particular lot. I think all metrical verse, which needs to be read aloud. I certainly read it aloud when I was in school, and I've always encouraged my students to do so. And for those of you who are teaching these, I would encourage your students to do so as well, as much as they can. Because it's for all that everybody wanders around these days with earbuds in their ears, the fact of the matter is that they don't listen to much by way of sound. And I don't think that they ordinarily have much of a real sense of rhythm, or a subtle sense of rhythm, and if its relationship to grammatical speech.
May I say something verbally, like real fast? Out loud. So I guess Raymond Vidal did not write a grammar then. According to Raymond Vidal, the writer of the Occitan grammar, Les Rasos de Trobar.
And that was when?
In 1192. I have to check the date.
Yes, he was probably trying to imitate those people down in Catalonia.
Yeah.
No, but officially they did not think it was.
Okay, great. We can next hear from Klaus, please.
Yeah, thank you, Mary, for the fantastic talk, particularly the images on murmuration were outright beautiful, and also the contemplations about it. I had a question with regard to what Tom said earlier, the question of motion and movement. One of the most intriguing figures of all figures in some sense are the ones where motion and rest come together. In Raimundos Lollos and in Cusanos, the idea of Trinity is often associated with that coincidence of rest and motion, particularly with respect to the sphere and to the circle. Mm-hmm. And that has, a long tradition in Heraclitus and Parmenides, the two contradictions also that move through Aristotle and Plato. And I wanted to ask you about this coincidence of those two, the immovable mover, that figure, the movement at a standstill that Plato and then also Cusanos investigated in the Sur-Nursery 1, where algebra is somehow still privileged over geometry in the figure of that one that somehow overarches at the origin of speech and writing and dimension and time. And I think it has a lot to do also with the dynamic and materiality of writing, in the sense that this origin of, or that writing in some sense is that togetherness of fixity and motion. Mm-hmm. So I just wanted you to talk more about the materiality of writing and that figure of motionless, standstill, at restlessness.
Yeah. It's the motion without moving. There's a very good article, it was in Dante Studies in 2013, I think, on the figure in Paradiso 33 of the tre giri, the three wheels, which move and do not move. And it was done by a couple of Dante scholars, but also a team of mathematicians who related it to topology. In other words, it's the movement of the mathematics of the rubber band, the geometry of the rubber band, as it has been explained to me. Tom will know much better than I do. But they attempted through CAD and various other things to and showed figures that could express this movement. You have to think of it as being like a belt, which moves constantly and yet doesn't go anywhere, constantly going back on itself. And that would be something like what was in mind. In the text I have read, this has usually been, the notion of it usually gets referred back to the idea of, oh, not to the idea, to the experience of mill wheels that move and yet don't go anywhere. So I think the motionless mover idea is, well, I would say it's as much out of practical experience and observation as it is out of high theology and philosophy. But then that's just me. I always have a prejudice in favor of practice rather than overly theory. Okay? And you have another one you want to, what was it? Okay.
Thank you, Klaus. Kenneth, go ahead.
Thanks very much, Mary. That was tremendous, and it was a really powerful and intense sort of drawing together of all of this work. And I felt kind of heady and a little dizzy as you were presenting, because I felt we were sort of on a precipice, or we sort of were standing on the edge of something, and it really felt it felt very thrilling. And I want to, and I'm not merely, I'm not clever enough to ask a question about any of the authors you're talking about, except Dante. And I want to kind of come back to this final passage, and I want to ask you, I suppose, how you now read this final vertiginous moment in the poem differently from the work that you've done. I mean, I was delighted to see you citing Sinclair, which feels like the kind of translation of a certain generation of scholar, I think. And there's a feel of perhaps an undergraduate translation, or an undergraduate kind of, as it was for myself. And so I'm kind of, it's even Sinclair is a bit out of fashion now, and it's a pity. And I'm conscious of that you've been reading this poem for a long time, and you've been reading this canto for a long time, and you've also been sort of nourishing that reading with this study. And so now I'm kind of wondering how you now read this final moment in the Paradiso differently.
The very last bit. Alta Fantasia, the last 4 lines, those, okay. Well, I understand Alta Fantasia better than I did before, because it was always just thought to be a metaphor. But what the Cistercian picture shows, to me at any rate, is that at least in the Cistercian tradition, there is, and this does go back to Augustine and to his literal commentary on Genesis, actually. Augustine says, he's talking about the brain, that you have to, memories at the front, he says, and then the part of the brain that governs muscular movement is at the rear. But he says, the thinking part, including memory, has to be at the top, because since I got that right. No, I'm sorry. Perception's at the front. That's right. Since perception's at the front. So the perception is received momentarily, and it would completely disappear without it being somehow codified and captured, collected, if you will, in the at the top of the head, which is where memory and later on imagination, etc., so using the Aristotelian grouping, is fixed. So that in order, it would have to be remembered and collected there, and then recollected at the back in order to retrieve or govern movement of the spinal cord and the muscles and so forth and so on. And that's always struck me as a rather weird idea, to tell you the truth. And I think most people who read Augustine would rather sort of have skipped over it. I think, you know, you're reading medieval stuff, very often you'll run across something you think, oh, I don't understand that at all. Or you'll think, well, that's rather embarrassing, actually. And you're not actually reading it. You're just skimming it, as Peter the Chanter said. But that idea is what really dominates, then comes down, I think, through the Augustinian tradition, which is largely a monastic tradition before it becomes, before the 12th, 13th century, and comes into the schools in various ways. But it fits very well with the doctrine of divine illumination, because the other thing about the geometric line is that rays, and that radius is, after all, the line, is the word that is used for the spokes within a circle, et cetera, et cetera. So the rays that come from the light are most powerful when they are straightest, when the distance is shortest and the line is straightest, and that's here. So there's a literalness to alta fantasia. There's a kind of medical quality to it, anatomical quality almost, although they weren't interested in that particularly, that we simply lose sight of when we read this only metaphor. Isn't that a wonderful metaphor for Dante to have used? So that's one thing I do. And of course, then the wheel with desire and will moves the sun and the other stars. Years ago, I heard a lecture about Dante's notions of gravity. It was a physical gravity, and pointing out that here there is a notion of gravity in Dante, and it's called love, but it's a force of attraction. Piero Boitani is the one who first drew my attention to that. Yeah. So that's another way in which I read it. I think I read it much more physically than I ever have before. Some years ago, I was teaching Dante, and I had a very good class of undergraduates at that point. And I can remember we read all three of the canticles. And so we'd gone through Inferno and Purgatorio, and we got to Paradiso. And a very smart kid in the class asked me, he said, Professor, how are we supposed to read Paradiso? Which I thought was very intriguing and good thing to say. I said, well, you have to read this as though it were a physics lesson. And that he was majoring actually in neurophysics. So in fact, it made good sense for him. But actually that made a great deal of sense to the students as a whole, because they weren't trying to do all the sort of psychologizing. There is no psychologizing really in Paradiso. We're beyond psychology. Good to see you.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Kenneth. We'll hear from Jennifer next.
Thanks so much for the wonderful talk. I was very taken by your description of the dynamic quality inherent in these geometrical drawings. And I wondered if they can depict extension in time, can they also be used to refer to events in human history? And I admit I'm thinking here of Joachim da Fiore, whose figures, of course, do relate to temporal ages through these interlacing circles. And I always thought of them as representing time, but not necessarily as embodying time. And I wondered if you had anything to add to that in light of these insights? Thank you.
Oh, I think it has a great deal to do with indeed embodying time. I think those genealogical charts among them should be understood more dynamically than simply the way we would read a genealogical chart, as you know, it's just sort of an outline of something else, not particularly interesting in and of itself. But in the way they read Genesis, the moment that God says in principio, time is created, time comes into being at exactly the same time. What's interesting, there's no prehistory in this particular physics, unlike us, right? There is no prehistory. History and space come into being at exactly the same moment and are ongoing. So it is indeed incredibly dynamic. So I think you always have to see in their understanding of history, the notion, because history is change and change is motion and motion is time. So they all go together so that it's implicit in everything. And I think, frankly, with Joachim, I think one of the things that got him into trouble with the papacy, as you remember, he got into a lot of trouble with the papacy, was because he was trying to give a specific date to the apocalypse, to the end time, which is by Orthodox standards is heretical, because we know not, according to the Gospels, according to Jesus, we do not know when the end of time would come. No man knows when the end of time comes. And so by claiming that he somehow could know, and of course, bringing into being this kind of, I suspect a certain amount of apocalypticism as we understand it, that is, naming a particular date for the end of time, was probably always in Christianity. I keep thinking of Simon Magus, for example, in the book of Acts, who gets, after all, into a lot of trouble. And they worried a lot about false prophets and things of that sort. But it becomes much more crucial, it seems to me, when you get into, the pre-Reformation stage and this whole, Europe simply becomes bigger and people are more in contact with one another. And the problem with that, as we know only too well, is that really weird ideas get sent around out there, most of which we don't particularly like, or at least the authorities don't particularly like. And so I would always read that as having this forward dimension. Because after all, the history for them is not about the past. It's always about the present and on into the future, which is the way time moves as well. Does that make any sense? Good to see you.
Well, speaking of the end of time, we've exceeded our limit here.
Oh dear.
So I don't want to cut short a discussion, but I don't want to hold you, Professor, for longer. Thank you so much to all of our questioners, to our organizers, and especially thank you, Professor Carruthers. That was really, really amazing. And I know we all look forward to the release of your upcoming book project. So thank you so much again for being here with us today. And
thank you.
Another virtual round of applause, please.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming, and look out for the recorded lecture soon.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks to everybody.
Yes, thank you again, Dr. Carruthers.